The MEI Art Gallery showcases the most exciting contemporary and modern art from the Middle East. Our current exhibit, Perceptible Rhythms, Alternative Temporalities, features 12 artists who explore the impact of conflict, urbanization, and the climate crisis on their environments. Open Monday through Friday from 10 to 5 p.m., the MEI Art Gallery is open to the public, or book your visit today at mei.edu/arts and culture center. From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Mohammed Mahmoud, Senior Fellow at MEI and the Director of the Climate and Water Program. Reliable water resources are an important part of long-term sustainability, especially when considering the environmental challenges posed by climate change. The importance of access to clean and safe water was emphasized by the 2023 UN World Water Development Report released in late March, ahead of the UN's first major water conference in over 40 years. The report illustrates the shortcomings in meeting the Sustainable Development Goal of clean water and sanitation by 2030, as approximately a quarter of the world's population doesn't have access to safe drinking water, and nearly half of the world's population lack access to basic sanitation. The Middle East and North Africa is exceptionally prone to risks associated with water reliability and security. The region is considered to be one of the most water-stressed parts of the world, with 12 MENA countries experiencing an extremely high baseline of water stress. As such, water scarcity is a universally binding challenge for all nations in the region, regardless of the differences between countries in their accessibility to various water resources. We asked several of MEI scholars to share their perspective on what they consider to be the most significant water resources issues in the MENA region. We begin with Malak Altaeb, who gives us a wide overview of the water scarcity and accessibility issues facing the Middle East and North Africa.
When we address water challenges in the MENA region, it's not only about the scarcity lens, but it goes beyond that. So discussing water scarcity in the Middle East and North Africa specifically includes multiple perspectives. Although the region is considered one of the scarcest regions in the world, having about 11 countries out of the 17 globally scarce countries worldwide, one of the main concerns one must highlight as a challenge when it comes to water management is quality and accessibility. The consideration of alternative resources when we discuss water scarcity and how we can manage water resources in the region is important to reduce pressure on groundwater aquifers, but focusing on the alternative perspective alone is not enough. So to deal with the challenges of water management in the region, a balance must be struck between existing water reserves and demand. This balance can be achieved by, for instance, employing strategies that increase water efficiency and conservation. Water conservation strategies must include minimizing the use of transportable water reserves, finding, of course, alternative water resources for multiple uses, and increasing the efficiency of water use with appropriate equipments. Also, one of the important tools to improve water accessibility is enhancing the data availability and making it an essential tool in understanding fluctuation of water. It allows for better policy decisions and management of the available resources in the region. Using such tools, which includes measurement tools that allows for monitoring of the existing water infrastructure, in addition to better policies and management perspective using such tools and technologies, it allows for better forecasting of future water consumption patterns, which can help in improving water networks and connections. But also when addressing non-conventional water resources, here I'm highlighting wastewater treatment for agriculture use and also desalination for household or domestic use. Quality improvement is a huge variable when we address that. That's why when we talk about water quality within the challenger's perspective, it's important to pinpoint the main objectives of improving water quality in order to ensure better qualities for the water available through non-conventional resources. So in terms of quality, water quality improvements must focus on the reduction of suspended sediments and the retention of pollutants and nutrients. Thus, it's a continuous process of applying technologies and improving the available tools in the region through knowledge management and knowledge enhancement within the water treatment field. So it's important to highlight in terms of challenges that we look beyond the non-conventional resources and providing, of course, other water resources within the MENA region, but we must address also the quality and accessibility lens, especially if we are talking about political and economic instabilities that are now rising and increasing within this region.
While securing adequate water supply is of utmost importance, successfully transferring this water to where it is needed is just as significant. Orestes Morfin walks us through the vulnerability of water infrastructure in the MENA region and the risks that threaten the reliability of these critical assets.
With a projected warming rate of almost twice the global average and a population that is dependent on climate-sensitive agriculture living primarily in large coastal urban zones, the MENA region is particularly sensitive to climate change. Recent conflicts and natural disasters in the region have underscored the importance of guaranteeing the security of MENA's water resources. For the purpose of this podcast, I will focus on the threats to and vulnerabilities of water infrastructure in MENA and discuss potential casualties. Threats to water infrastructure may be diverse both in nature and effect. Sources may be anthropogenic due to conflict or external natural disasters such as the February 6, 2023 earthquake in southeast Turkey. Related to external factors, aging constitutes an often overlooked threat to water infrastructure security. Even if operating in stable zones free of conflict, water treatment plants and desalination plants in particular have an average operational life of 25 to 30 years before they must be upgraded and the mechanical equipment in them replaced. In terms of effect, damage inflicted to water infrastructure does not need to be permanent in order to disrupt the society that depends on it. Prolonged, intermittent outages or disruptions in service can wreak as much economic or social havoc as the wholesale obliteration of one facility. Vulnerabilities of water infrastructure are similarly multifaceted. Beyond the obvious threat of physical damage to impoundment facilities, such as dams and power reservoirs, conveyance structures associated with these facilities, extensive canals, or pipelines that often cross remote regions and may be difficult to monitor, are uniquely vulnerable by the very nature of their design. Physical damage to water treatment facilities, if rendered inoperable, may also serve to completely negate the benefit of the rest of an otherwise intact storage and conveyance system. A less commonly considered vulnerability is that of expertise. The successful and safe operation of most water infrastructure involves a complex analysis of source forecasting, current and forecasted demand, regional climatic and groundwater conditions, and power availability. Staffing and maintaining the expertise necessary to operate water infrastructure is itself a daunting task, and conflict and natural disasters can make it exponentially harder not just to staff such positions, but to maintain them as well. Finally, the investment drain and unavailability of financing opportunities in conflict-ridden or disaster-prone areas constitutes a vulnerability. An exodus of investment capital, as occurred in Syria at the onset of the civil war, can be a compounding factor in attracting and retaining the expertise necessary to rebuild, operate, and maintain water infrastructure. Potential casualties due to damaged water infrastructure include human health and safety, critical industry, and food supplies. Attacks on water infrastructure may either negate or reinforce its strategic importance, depending on whether it is completely destroyed or captured and weaponized. The Islamic State targeting of dams in Syria and Iraq is a prime example of such weaponization. In this case, the chaos wrought by engineered flooding and/or drought in select areas was balanced with the restoration of service in others as a valuable recruiting tool. The Islamic State occupation showcased this sort of complex awareness as a particularly intractable problem for the international community and proved that the weaponization of water infrastructure could be used as leverage not only against one's enemies, but as an effective PR tool as well. Finally, damage to water treatment infrastructure has the potential to spread waterborne disease and render supply effectively unusable. A holistic assessment of the sources of threat, the vulnerabilities, and ultimately the potential casualties of damage to water infrastructure is therefore essential for MENA nations in order to effectively manage risk and safeguard human health and safety.
An often overlooked water-related challenge is the impact of war on water resources. Megan Ferrando expounds on this by discussing how water is weaponized and manipulated during regional conflicts, and how this leads to a number of very detrimental outcomes.
In the media and policy circles, we're currently putting a lot of emphasis on how water scarcity and droughts in the MENA region might lead to conflicts, to so-called wars over water. But we tend to pay less attention to the other way around, what the impact is of conflicts on water resources, on people's ability to have access to enough safe water during conflicts. So I'd like to take some time to highlight that particular aspect. And I'd roughly divide these threats to water during conflicts between voluntary and involuntary threats. So if we look at voluntary threats, as water is essential for human survival and for the functioning of society, it can be an attractive target for control, leverage, and terror during conflicts. This happens in the Middle East and North Africa more than in any other world region, because water often already tends to be scarce, and withholding it or threatening to withhold it can be a very powerful tool. We've seen this during several conflicts in the past decade alone. In Libya, the vast majority of the population depends on a massive public water pipeline for their water needs, called the Great Man-Made River Project. Over the course of the civil war since 2011, conflict parties have regularly attacked the pipeline and cut off water supplies, depriving millions of water. When Islamic State was in control of large parts of Iraq, it hijacked key water infrastructure along the Tigris and the Euphrates to consolidate its power. This allowed Islamic State to deprive people from water, ruining their harvest, but they were also able to flood government-held farmland, displacing tens of thousands of people in the area. In Yemen, which has been in conflict since 2014, deliberate attacks on water infrastructures like water reservoirs are commonplace, as Houthi rebel groups aim to seize control of these water facilities, and Saudi forces regularly destroy them. Civilians then get stuck in the middle, with lack of access to basic water resources further worsening an already devastating humanitarian situation. The problem here is that as climate change is set to worsen, this will lead to further shortages of natural resources such as water. Water then becomes an increasingly attractive asset for conflict parties to gain competitive advantage over each other. But most often, water insecurity is actually involuntary collateral damage during conflict, and the effects are more diffuse and indirect. For example, there's of course the destruction of water facilities, like when water reservoirs and water canals are hit, which prevents clean water from reaching towns and cities. And because of frequent power cuts, important facilities like wastewater treatment plants and public water supply can stop functioning, which leads to deterioration of quality of the water. But we also see that weapon residues and chemicals get into the water cycle through abandoned military vehicles, ammunition, and weapons. In Libya, for example, the strategic destruction of oil storage facilities has led oil, explosives, and other toxic waste to seep into the groundwater. So while not necessarily on purpose, these acts during conflicts impact both the quantity of available water and make this water more unsafe for use, which opens the way to waterborne diseases, like we're currently seeing with the cholera outbreak in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And because of frequent power and water cuts in conflicts, public health facilities like hospitals often cannot function properly to deal with the surge in diseases. The threat of disease spread is further aggravated when people are forced to live close together in unsanitary conditions and with limited water resources, such as in camps for refugees and internally displaced people. UNICEF recently reported that in countries in long-term conflicts, children under the age of 15 are 3 times more likely to die from diseases due to a lack of clean water and sanitation than from direct violence. So these numbers, of course, they depend on the country and on the state of the conflict, but it's important to realize that we tend to think of the threat of war through the lens of direct violence, although indirect violence through access to basic needs can be an even greater threat. So I just wanted to share some quick examples of how conflict affects water resources. This then has its own effect on conflict again. When people lose access to sufficient, safe water, this can combine with other grievances and continue to fuel violence. A lack of water also affects agricultural production, for example, thereby affecting people's jobs and food security. And if you make the connections to climate impacts, war is highly polluting. It severely increases carbon emissions, destroys ecosystems. During conflicts, environmental and climate interests tend to fall to the bottom of the priority list, which is devastating for a region that is already being hit so hard by the climate crisis. So, water insecurity and conflicts are a vicious cycle. It's too limiting to only think about how climate change will increase water scarcity and might lead to conflicts. But it's true that as the climate crisis worsens, this will put additional pressure on natural resources such as water, which will then intentionally and unintentionally become more central factors in fueling and perpetuating conflicts.
We now shift to a couple of specific geographic topics, starting with Zena Agha and the challenges associated with water accessibility and availability in the Palestinian territories.
My research looks at water in the Palestine-Israel context. So although Palestinians and Israelis inhabit the same physical terrain, Palestinians who live under occupation, and by that I mean Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, will suffer the effects of climate change as it relates to water more severely and more acutely. And this is primarily due to the ongoing Israeli occupation, which has been going on for over 50 years, which frequently prevents Palestinians from accessing resources, pursuing measures to support climate change adaptation, and so on and so forth. Of course, climate change affects Palestine in loads of different ways, but I'm focusing today on water. One of the greatest casualties, actually, of climate change in the occupied Palestinian territory will be water availability and quality. So first, freshwater resources, and by that I mean surface and groundwater, will become much more scarce as rainfall decreases, which is the biggest projected impact of climate change in an already water scarce region. This will make it much harder to replenish aquifers during periods of high population growth and simultaneously intensifying competition for water from Palestinian agriculture, as well as illegal Israeli settlements and industry. So reduced rainfall will make extracting water more costly and, of course, more energy intensive. Higher temperatures and increased sediment may also threaten the quality of the drinking water, given the very limited treatment facilities available on the ground. Second, since climate change increases the likelihood of intense, short bursts of rainfall as opposed to an extended wet season, flash floods are highly likely. The OPT's existing infrastructure is not capable of supporting heavy rainfall, which could lead to flooding in urban areas due in part to inadequate drainage and sewage systems. But of course, the elephant in the room is that water is not an apolitical resource. The occupation strains water resources and affects areas from health to industry. Palestinians' main source of drinking water is stored groundwater, and Palestinians rely heavily on aquifers. So the western, northeastern, and eastern aquifers are actually in the West Bank, while in Gaza, the only source of water is the coastal aquifer, which has been subjected to over-extraction and pollution. And in fact, it's so salinated at the moment that seawater fish can live in it. This is in addition to rising sea levels and the intrusion of seawater, given that Gaza lies on the Mediterranean coast. The Israeli regime has created a very complicated bureaucracy of licensing, permits, and access rights designed to control and selectively curtail Palestinians' access to groundwater. Primarily, it does this through the powers granted to it by the 1995 Oslo II Accords, which was, of course, intended only as a 5-year interim agreement and yet are still in place today. And this granted Israel control over approximately 80% of water reserves in the occupied West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, the body in charge of Palestinian water in the West Bank, cites these inequalities which are hemmed into the Oslo Accords and has been seeking water rights over the mountain aquifers. Israel exacts control over water through a body called the Joint Water Committee, and this prohibits any water-related decision from being made without prior Israeli approval. Surface water from rivers, streams, creeks, lakes, reservoirs, etc., comes primarily from the Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River, which the Joint Water Committee prohibits Palestinians from accessing and whose discharge is estimated to decrease significantly over the coming years. Palestinians are also riparians of the Jordan River, affording them water rights. However, since Israel has full control over the headwaters of the Jordan River, Palestinians have absolutely no access. And finally, the Joint Water Committee has also denied permits to Palestinians seeking to capture runoff water in dams. Meanwhile, there are only a few wastewater treatment facilities in the West Bank, and hardly any of the treated water is reused in agriculture. Developing new water access or repairing infrastructure is extremely difficult. Israel grants very few permits and demolishes any buildings and wells which are made without them. In addition to preventing enough clean water from entering the Gaza Strip, Israel hinders any attempt to build or maintain water infrastructure such as reservoirs by restricting imports of fundamental building materials. And the results are deadly. This is not an abstraction. Between 90 to 95% of water in Gaza is contaminated and unfit for drinking or irrigation. Contaminated water accounts for over 26% of all reported diseases in Gaza and is a leading cause of child mortality. The upshot of these measures is significant. Palestinian localities in the West Bank are connected to the water network, but 65% are relying on water tankers, and this water is 3 to 6 times more costly than piped water and often poor quality. So we're starting to see the effects of all of these things on a household, individual basis. Altogether, this means that the occupied Palestinian territories have some of the lowest per capita water availability in the world, at 72 litres per capita per day in the West Bank and 96 litres in Gaza, both of which are less than the 100-litre minimum recommended by the World Health Organizations. Palestinians in some places are not connected to the water grid, such as communities located in Israeli-controlled Area C, and often live on just 10 to 20 litres per capita per day for all of their water usage. And just by contrast, Israel's over 600,000 illegal settlers use 6 times more water than the entire Palestinian population in the West Bank, which is conservatively estimated at some 3 million people. Settlements use as much as 700 litres per capita per day for domestic use, or more for amenities like swimming pools or lawns. And additionally, the destructive actions of settlements, as we're seeing in this current period, frequently destroy Palestinian property and infrastructure and further intensify Palestinian vulnerability and water scarcity. It's important to remember that a lot of this research actually treats a fragmented part of Palestine, namely the occupied Palestinian territories of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, saying nothing of the Israeli-occupied territory of the Golan, which is Syrian national land, and of course Palestinians who live within the Green Line, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who also deal with extensive apartheid conditions.
Our next geographic topic is presented by Youssef Wehbe, who talks about the missed opportunity of leveraging enhanced rainfall as an added source of water supply in the region, using the example of the UAE's Rainfall Enhancement Program.
I'd like to talk about an often overlooked aspect of water security and sustainability, namely rainfall enhancement technology. Historically, this technology has not received the attention it deserves as a key component of water security, particularly in the MENA region. Now, coincidentally, the United Arab Emirates has been at the forefront of using cloud seeding technology and was chosen to host the COP28 event later this year in Dubai. This really provides a significant opportunity for the GCC region to showcase its commitment to combating climate change and to promote sustainable development. Now, it's essential to understand that rainfall enhancement technology should not be viewed as a substitute for other crucial components of water security, such as desal and wastewater recycling and reuse. Instead, it should be considered a reliable complementary source of water with specific applications in areas like targeted agriculture and managed aquifer recharge. I'd like to dive into the numbers to see how rainfall enhancement technology can help meet the UAE's water demands, for example. So taking the UAE's annual average rainfall rate of 80 millimeters and considering its surface area of roughly 84,000 square kilometers, the average annual rainfall volume amounts to approximately 6.7 billion cubic meters. Now, the UAE currently seeds all available rain-bearing clouds at any given time and location across the country. However, let's again use a conservative estimate of only 50% of seeded cloud targets and a 10% increase in surface rainfall associated to seeding. We can then do a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation and estimate a volume of rainfall attributed exclusively to seeding to be roughly 335 million cubic meters per year. Now, with this very conservative estimate, seeded rainfall can meet 7.4% of the UAE's annual average water demand of roughly 4.5 billion cubic meters. Now, when it comes to costs, water tariffs in the UAE and other GCC nations are heavily subsidized and don't necessarily reflect actual production costs. That said, the production cost for desalinated water in the UAE is reported as 31 cents per cubic meter, according to the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority. Now, the key aspect of cloud seeding technology is that it's not only a reliable source of water, but also cost effective. Now, cloud seeding missions, according to the UAE National Center of Meteorology, can cost up to $8,000 per flight hour. And back in 2020, we had 390 flights, each with an average duration of 1 flight hour. Now, when considering the seeded rainfall volume of 335 million cubic meter that I mentioned earlier, the unit cost from seeding can be estimated at a mere 1 cent per cubic meters. Now, that's 30 times less than the unit production cost of desal. And these are very conservative estimates that we're looking at right here. Now, the caveat is that in order to harness the full potential of cloud seeding technology as a reliable and cost-effective source of renewable water, it's necessary to make parallel investments in rainwater harvesting as well as groundwater recharge systems, in addition to transmission systems. And this is directly comparable to the critical challenges and investments being made in solar energy storage and transmission. Now, with the UAE hosting the COP28 event later this year, this provides a significant opportunity for other GCC regions to showcase its commitment to combating climate change and promoting sustainable development. So let's unlock the full potential of rainfall enhancement as a game changer in water security and sustainability.
Finally, Andrei Covatariu showcases how drought can influence the water-energy nexus and why a decline in freshwater resources can be a precursor to an energy crisis.
When it comes to the energy sector, water is a critical component of our current and future systems. The increasingly dependent water-energy nexus is intensifying across the globe, and as global energy demand increases, the need for fresh water increases, affecting more and more this equilibrium. Moreover, the extended version of this tension, what is called the water-energy food nexus, is complicating even more this picture, and actually the projections for the next decades are severe. But coming back to energy, last year we've witnessed some dramatic events in Europe. A droughty summer led to a decrease in output generation for hydropower plants. It led to reduced activity for nuclear power plants, especially in France, but also brought difficulties in supplying coal to coal power plants, and that is especially the case of Germany. And these water-related factors have contributed to last year's energy crisis in Europe. But what concerns most specialists is the increasing frequency and intensity of lower precipitation, lower snow cover, the increasing frequency and intensity of these droughts in general, phenomena which leads to a chronic energy generation issue. But as challenging as they are, these water energy issues in Europe are still manageable to some extent. But the situation in the Middle East and the water security level of the region are posing higher difficulties in the years to come, which calls for efficiency in how and to which extent water is needed for energy generation. Although all energy generators require water for energy production, Moving away from water-intensive generators is within reach in the region, renewables such as solar PVs or wind power plants being a clear answer to this. In addition to these pressing issues, the Middle East also aims to lead the global efforts of hydrogen production, which is actually a water-intensive process. And that is because water will be needed both for the electrolysis process and for the electricity needed in this. So scaling up hydrogen production brings some alarming risks of affecting water securities for some communities in the region. And for these reasons, proper planning for future hydrogen facilities will be essential to move forward these long-term hydrogen strategies.
And that concludes this week's episode. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this episode. For more information on topics like this, you can follow all of MEI's coverage of climate and water on our website at www.mei.edu. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And you can follow MEI on Twitter and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information on upcoming events. I'm Mohammed Mahmoud. We will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.